Hey Mo, how's it going?
How's it going? How's it going in the
So
garden?
Mo, last week was Friday or was it Thursday was the end of the case, the Assange case, which went on for a few weeks, which you brilliantly covered along with many other of the great journalists that we do have in this country who were talking about it. Um, I wanted to get you on and talk about it and talk because obviously it wrapped on Thursday. We're not going to get the result. Is it till January? The judge said that she's going to make the decision.
4th of January 2021, we'll all end up back in court to hear the decision.
And there's closing arguments written, isn't it, to be made, and then obviously the response from the prosecution.
So defense will have four
And
weeks, 4 weeks from the close for closing arguments. So that's the end of October. Prosecution will have 2 weeks from then. And then I believe the defense will have further 72 hours for a response to the response if it's need be, I think.
now you were there. Was it every day you were there?
I was there every single day. I covered every day of the hearing, most of it via video link. I rented a lounge, a business lounge, about a 10-minute walk from the Old Bailey, around down the streets and around the corner. And I would log in and I'd sit down in the lounge with my computer and I'd log into the video link system, the secure link system, because only a certain number of people were given access to that.
Yeah.
And then on the final week, I decided to try my luck to get in, and I was able to. I got in early one day, and then eventually I spoke to some people who put my name on the list so that I could continue to attend the hearings physically from inside the courtroom. But even then, it's in the press annex, and the press annex is the court next door, and therefore it's via video link.
Yeah, I managed to
So
get in on the. I was telling you off air. I managed to get into the court on the Monday afternoon because of some great friends that I've got down there who managed to get me in. And I saw the testimony of Mr. Sickler. We were talking about that just before we came and started recording this. He was the Department of Corrections sort of like expert who talked to him about which prison to send a prisoner to in America and the prison conditions, etc., etc. And I was there on the Monday, and apparently it was the worst day for the defence. We can go into that for a little bit, but I just want to, if possible, you say the little press annex there. We'll start there because, it was extremely. The security was beyond anything I'd seen. It was right at the very top of the Old Bailey, wasn't it, the court? And I walked in there, and you go up about 4 flights of stairs. I'm just going to try, if you don't mind, and paint the picture for people to what I saw as sort of like a member of the public viewing it. So you walked up and you had to go through X-ray. You had to put your bag and your coat and everything in X-ray, and they scanned it all. And you walked up the flight of stairs right up to the top of the Old Bailey, to the courts at the top of the Old Bailey. Now, for all the Assange supporters out there who were screaming and shouting whistles and shouting slogans and bipping horns and everything, for all those people who are out there, I can tell you this. Up those stairs, you could hear them every single step of the way, couldn't you? So Julian Assange, who was in that court with, nothing but the roof above, over him, he wasn't in the bowels of the Old Bailey or anything like that. They will have heard every single chant, wouldn't they? When I was at the top of the stairs, I could still hear them chanting.
I can say we could definitely hear them from outside of the court. That's for certain, including in the work area that's right outside of Court 9 and Court 10, which is where the hearings are being held.
Yeah.
Inside the court, I don't know what level of insulation they have, but even when he would be in the back area of the court being prepped for transport, you had people around the corner, around the side, shouting where the giant door is. I actually tweeted out a little video at one point when people were playing with drums. It was quite a nice percussion sort of sound to it. On one of the days where he was being, I think it might have been one of the final days where he would have been.
Yeah, they were really
before
loud
he was transported.
They were really.
So yeah. And you could hear them. I remember once seeing James Lewis QC, so one of the prosecution barristers. There's a great picture. I wish you could take pictures from inside the court, but I wasn't prepared to risk it because it's it's disallowed. It's an offence. And with James Lewis staring outside of the window. This is as all this work is being done to finalize, come to agreements between various statements between the parties. So this is on the final day, the final Thursday, with his hands behind his back, just folded behind his back as he's looking out the window where all the demonstrators are, which you could hear. And I was with Tarek Haddad, another journalist, and we were just looking at him, looking down there. And I remember thinking, I wish we had Barnaby Naburka's camera, if you know Barnaby from Rupley, who's got this camera from the 1970s, which takes these great photos. You might have seen some of them actually on Twitter.
I have, I know which ones you're talking about.
And if I don't know if at some point maybe you'll be able to splice one of the photos in this so people can see the tint, the great 70s sort of tint there. And it seared into my mind. We were both saying, "Oh, let's take a picture." But of course,
the court for the observers, and it was like you said, the press annex. It was like we were overlooking basically a court with just press in, and it was sort of like the court was next door to Assange's court, and it was sort of like a mirror image of the court, wasn't it? So we weren't actually in the court with him, but we could see all the monitors, and essentially what we could see in there was what you journalists could see on the live feed, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
We were just watching the live feed of the TVs from the room next door, and we obviously saw all the journalists who were there, the BBC journalist, the guy who fell asleep reading the Daily Mail. A journalist fell asleep during it, and while I was there, it was incredible. And while I can say this, hand on heart, while I was in that court, you could hear them shouting outside the Assange supporters. So, my opinion, if that court was next door and it was a mirror image, I'm pretty sure that he would have heard them too. So, I mean, to all the Assange supporters who were brilliant and they were shouting and screaming the whole time, he would have heard you. I am absolutely sure of that. Now, I'll go in a little bit. I came out, even though on that Monday, everybody agreed. I think Craig Murray wrote that this was the worst day for the defence that Monday, because this Sickler, they woke him up. I think it was 4 o'clock in the morning, and over in America, and you could see they were doing all the lawyery tricks to throw him off balance, to get him discombobulated. So he ended up at many stages just as this Claire Dobbin, I think her name was, who was the barrister for the prosecution. You and I mentioned it. She's got the most obnoxious voice in the world ever. She was saying stuff like, "So, Mr. Sickler, on page number 292, paragraph 47, it states that the Department of Correction Facilities in the United States have got a 15-point plan after their meeting in 2018 that you referred to in subsection 2.4 of your statement. And they say the 15-point plan was going to increase and make it better, so inmates increase the conditions and inmates wouldn't obviously commit suicide as much. Doesn't that say to you, Mr. Sickler, that the Department of Corrections facility in the United States care for their prisoners?" To which he was, he was like, "Well, I don't know which paragraph you're talking about." And she was like, "Well, I gave it you. You do not know your statement." It was just so obnoxious, and you could see it was all the proper lawyery tricks to throw him off balance. Now, you were there the whole day, the whole time rather, and I only saw just glimpses of it. Was it like this the whole time? Was she that obnoxious the whole time? Because I'm not kidding you, I heard her for 2 hours, and I went to bed that night, and I was having nightmares about that voice.
I do recall on whether it was that day, on a separate day, tweeting out that Claire Dobbin's tone drips with condescension. And I have to say, much more so than what you were just doing, right? She does it.
I don't do it.
She does it. Yeah, you don't do it justice. So the statement you were doing, that I can even imagine hearing that from her, but just the tone. And I did ask in the tweet, I said, I don't know if this is deliberate to get under the skin of the witness, which I think that's probably more. I think it's probably true. I'm sure it gets emphasized a bit, just to get under the skin of the witness to increase their, which I have to say is pretty clever, I suppose. Or it could just be how she speaks normally. I shudder to think that that's how she speaks normally. I feel sorry for her and everyone else around or if
Can't
that's
imagine that that is the way she speaks
no,
normally.
no. But there is this, you know, to her voice. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, well,
Oh
wouldn't you
God,
agree
it's
the
just
pace 200?
it's
When I
hours
was
of
there,
that.
yeah, and
And I
6 months,
remember thinking, I tip my hat to you, ma'am. Well done. It
it
doesn't
really
matter
was.
how on spot your point is, just here. And I have to say, you know, setting aside Sickler, every other witness I saw her speak to, their response, you know, they were measured,
Yeah.
including ones coming from the States where they hadn't had much sleep, where one of the greatest battles, which unfortunately the sound wasn't always perfect, was with another female lawyer who has practiced in the Eastern District of Virginia, which is the area
Mhm.
in which is on one of the final days, in fact, and it's the area in which Julian Assange would face a trial where he'd
Now,
be
Eastern District of Virginia. This is where Langley is, correct, or in the
yes. So
vicinity of Langley,
exactly. So there
headquarters
was
of
one of the
CIA.
experts. One of the experts was a jury expert, a jury consultant in the United States. So they read his testimony. He didn't speak via video link
Mhm.
because it was unchallenged. See, what would happen is there's two things going on. One, there is a legal obligation in the criminal procedure rules for both parties to agree to as much as possible to assist the court. That I don't know if that exists in the States, but it does exist here. And I don't know how long it's existed here. I know it was here when I went to law school, but I don't know for how long it's been the case. Maybe years, maybe decades. But that obligation is on both parties, that you have to work together to come to agree as much as possible, as much as you're able to agree. And then there's the other thing, which is that if you do come to an agreement about a statement, which doesn't necessarily mean that the prosecution accepts all of the words in it. It just means they're agreeing not to challenge, which makes it slightly confusing. If they essentially, that means if they say they're not going to cross-examine a statement, then the judge is like, okay, well then that literally means there's no reason to hear testimony from the witness because
Mhm.
I have all the witness statements. I've already read all the witness statements. I am the ultimate decision maker. There's no jury here.
Yeah.
So there is no need. And of course, it's the defense who pressured the court to say, well, okay, that's not fair. And we think it's important for a few key reasons. A, we think it still would aid you, right, to hear a synopsis at least. So she gave the defense a maximum 30 minutes per witness to do what's known as examination in chief, right, which is when you just examine a witness based on what they've said already in the statement. But you've only got half an hour and then cross-examine happens. And the vast majority of the time, these are defense witnesses. So the prosecution has most of the time because they get to cross-examine. They said it would aid you, but more importantly, it would aid the witness to get situated. In many cases, they've only woken up an hour or less before
Yeah.
the video link, and it would aid the press and the public. And they emphasized the importance of that. They said, look, if the public all they're hearing is cross-examination, then we're going to understand what's going on, right? And it
I
was
get it. Yeah.
important, yeah, because then you're just hearing cross-examination. You're
Yeah.
not even hearing, don't even know what they've said in their witness statement. But they had to fight for that on the day because it looked like they just assumed that they were going to be able to do it, and then eventually the judge on the first day, and the prosecution was making a big deal of this as well. The judge's like, but nobody else is deciding this. I'm deciding this. I've already read the statements. Why do I need to hear? And then eventually they were able to harangue 30 minutes per witness out of her, which I
Yeah.
think made all the difference. It made all the difference to be able to hear the defense first interview or examine their witnesses before they're cross-examined. So that's just that part, I think, which is important for people to understand the structure of it. But the jury consultant, who's an expert, he broke down, he's like, this is how jury systems work in the United States, right? So, and this is how a court gets its jury, because every court has a jury pool, and you can't
Mhm.
get anybody from wherever. They've got to come from specific constituencies and with specific boundaries, right?
Mhm.
And then they said, let's look at, he's been indicted in the Alexandria court in the Eastern District of Virginia. Okay, let's look at that. There's 4 divisions. Okay, which division is he in? He's in this division. This division gets its jury pool from A, B, C, D constituencies. So now let's look at the primary employer and these A, B, C
It's
constituencies
going to be
from which
Langley,
this
isn't it?
division of the court in Alexandria. And he named them. It was the Central Intelligence Agency, Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the Federal Bureau of Investigations,
So
and then And then Northrop Grumman, so there were various weapons contractors, right? Northrop Grumman's a military contractor. He named a couple others, some of which the names, but there were a number of constituencies. So he would do that one. Then they went to this other one. The top employer here is the FBI, then the CIA, then Homeland. So basically it was a repetition of each one, just it was
So
who was the largest employer.
the
And so
jury pool, if he is
will,
extradited, will come
yeah.
from basically the family members of the CIA and
Or actual
FBI, or friends, or neighbors.
No, not just family members, actual employees or their family members. So it might be straight
Surely
up
they
employees.
can't do that though. Surely they can't just fill it with CIA employees.
But it's random. But it's randomly selected, right? But it's randomly selected.
And not only that, we wouldn't know.
Yeah, it's randomly selected from populations that work at all these institutions or their family members. That's the point of the jury thing. So they're basically saying we can effectively guarantee. I mean, let's be honest, right? Is it coincidence that every single major Espionage Act case using the Espionage Act, including against whistleblowers, is filed at the Eastern District of Virginia?
It's all the same judge as well, isn't it?
I think it's the same judge for many years at least.
John Kiriakou was talking, and
John Kiriakou had his case filed there, and I saw him in an interview a few weeks ago where he was saying exactly this. He said, "Look, I had a jury consultant in my case when I was, because for people who don't know, John Kiriakou, longtime CIA intelligence officer who blew the whistle, but very lightly. If you actually watch the interview, doing I think an interview on CBS or ABC News, he happened to mention the fact that there was one detainee under the CIA control who was waterboarded. And in fact, based on the information he was given at the time, because he didn't say that he had direct firsthand knowledge, he said based on what he was told, he was waterboarded a few times and they got actionable intelligence, but it was still wrong because this isn't who we are. This is bad for America. Now, since then, he pointed out that he found out that that was a lie, that he'd been waterboarded like 180 times and no actionable intelligence came out. So even CIA officers are lying to other CIA officers, which is an important thing that I always try to tell people. The idea that everybody knows what's going on, even within a single agency, simply isn't true. Even within the CIA, people are lying to each other and misleading each other. So I think that's important for people to understand. When
they're trained to do it.
Well, exactly, it's part of the job. But when people try to understand how institutions work, the idea that everybody who works, all 100,000 people or even 1,000 people all know, it actually works in the interest of those who hold power, that the right hand doesn't always know what the left hand is doing. And if for people who want to understand this better, there's a great 1-hour video online called The Making of a Modern British Soldier, which is a talk given by Ben Griffin, who's a former SAS commander, SAS soldier who was in Iraq, as well as I think stationed for a while in Northern Ireland, not during the Troubles, I don't believe. I don't think he's old enough to have been doing the Troubles. And then it was in Iraq, and then he discusses the process by which he ends up, when he joins, and then the process by which the training he goes through, eventually the training, the SAS training as well, and then what ends up happening in Iraq. And he talks about how the activities of the unit are compartmentalized, right? So one person is gathering the supposed intelligence, and then they're sending to another group of people saying, you need to break down this door to grab this person. Then another group of people break down that door and grab those people. Then that's it. Their job is done. They pass it on to another group of people who are now doing the interrogations. And he describes it, and it's quite good how he describes the compartmentalization process and why that's done deliberately. And he goes back historically as to why military psychologists and other planners learned because of past issues because they learn after each war, when there's mutinies or when there's problems. So just to put that into context.
There's a movie. It's a terrible movie. Don't watch it. Die Hard 4. It was
but with the son, I think.
No. It was the one. Wasn't that one? It was the one after the Samuel L. Jackson one. It was the one where Live Free or Die Hard, I think it was called. Anyway, there was what they call a fire sale, and the guy Timothy Omnifant or something like that his name is. Anyway, the protagonist in the movie,
John McClane.
he gets some tech guys to write a program that shuts down the entire country. It's sort of like a virus. And there is no one tech guy who writes the virus, because obviously one tech guy wouldn't write that thing because it's horrible. You would bring down the entire country. So what he does is he gets one guy to write this little bit of code and one guy to write that little bit of code. And none of these tech guys actually know what they're doing. None of them. They just think, oh, I've got this job to write this little bit of code and I'm doing it. That's it. I've got my $2,000, my payments, and I can go off and do my thing. Nobody actually knows the scale of the evil that they do. And this is what you're talking about there, isn't it? With the way these soldiers are trained and the way everything is compartmentalized, so that anybody with a conscience doesn't actually know what's going on and therefore wouldn't actually refuse any order. Correct?
Yeah. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So John Kiriakou ultimately was the only person who got prosecuted. Of course, they didn't prosecute him for whistleblowing. It was something else, a convoluted story. People can look it up.
Yeah, he was the only person prosecuted for the torture program, correct?
Yeah, well, for waterboarding, but it wasn't. None of that was mentioned. It wasn't for torture. It wasn't even for the disclosures. Although I think we can surmise, based on how things developed after this award-winning for the CIA. You know, he got various accolades in the CIA, so he was highly regarded. But basically, if you look at what happened to him after he has that interview, and you look at the nature of his prosecution, it was about supposedly revealing the identity of a source, but even when you look at the details, it was very convoluted. And he was prosecuted in the Espionage Act court, as it's known, as it's colloquially known. I don't think it's formally known that way, because you could be prosecuted at any court, right? Criminal charges could be brought anywhere under the Espionage Act. It doesn't have to be that court specifically, but it's chosen for the reason that we've described, because the jury pool comes from all the major national security institutions, right? Them or their family members. And he said, when he had his jury consultant who told John, he said, look, if we had this trial anywhere else in the country, I'd say go ahead, because you'd have an excellent chance given the facts of your case and the state of affairs, the climate the country is in currently, etc. You know, the mass surveillance has been exposed, and just the feeling towards the war and what have you, because it's been some time now where all that jingoistic hyper-nationalist environment post 9/11 that had been cultivated by the establishment was waning. I mean, that's ultimately how Obama was able to get elected, you know, as comedian Jim Adore likes to say, you know, a black Kenyan with a Muslim sounding name, right? How can you get that elected to president of the United States?
Trump,
Yeah, that's because there was just so much anger and frustration that even lifelong Republicans were like, oh, this guy looks different, I'll vote for him. Which is why it was a clever move on the part of the establishment to back him, right? Because obviously he was much more of a continuation than he was a deviation. But he sounded different and he looked different, and he wasn't like he didn't have the shit kicker sort of personality that Bush had. So many Americans were like, oh, thank God for that. It's sort of like the Trump effect, I'm sure we'll see with why Biden's polling is so much higher. But his Kiriakou's, just to finalize that story, Kiriakou's consultant says to Kiriakou, because it's this jury, because you're getting it in the Eastern District of Virginia, I'm telling you right now that like you have like basically no chance. And it was said during that interview, and I haven't personally confirmed this, and that would take a bit of research, that it effectively has 100% conviction rate for cases brought under the Espionage Act. And I suppose you can understand. And we can go into this. A number of the witnesses that were brought up by the defense lawyers were experts in the Espionage Act itself. They'd either represented many people who had been prosecuted under it, or in one case, they were an academic, a lawyer, researcher, constitutional expert academic who had co-authored the only treatise on the Espionage Act in the United States, right? They're looking at its history, looking at its application, so its theory and its practice since it was written since it was published in 1917, because it's over 100 years old.
It was originally published it was originally written to punish conscientious objectors.
Two things.
World War
one thing,
one
thing, it targets actual espionage, right? Okay. So it targets actual people who are conspiring for foreign power to steal information and pass it on, right? And then the other thing, and you even have quotes from Woodrow Wilson at the time, it was used for, and in theory and in practice, to target people who were opponents to the United States joining the First World War. So not just conscientious objectors, people who were at least 2,000 people, the first 2,000 people prosecuted under the Espionage Act, and this is a point that he made.
Yeah, they were interned, weren't
No, they were. No, they were.
camps.
These were people who were arrested, prosecuted, and convicted explicitly for political speech. So they were. These are explicitly political speech offenses. So, for
Right.
example, here's a perfect example: Eugene Debs. Right, Eugene Debs is a famous socialist in the United States. He ran for, I think, the Socialist Party as president, and he gave a speech. People can look it up, right? Because you can read it. Because that's what he was prosecuted for, the speech, for violating the Espionage Act. And the speech effectively says, working class people are the ones who fight and die in these wars. We're the ones who are asked to kill, and we're the ones who are asked to die.
Yeah.
So working class people should be the ones who decide if we're going to war, right? And this is an imperialist war, a bankers' war, and we shouldn't, this European bankers' war, because actually American finance had backed one side of the war. And when it looked like they might be losing, then there was lots of pressure, because they'd be like, oh, we're going to lose all the money. So we can't allow basically the Germans to win, because then we'll lose the money because we back the other side. I mean, that's why people in the United States, many people were calling it a bankers' war. And in fact, Woodrow Wilson got elected campaigning, saying he kept us out of that war. That was his thing. And then he reversed it. He went to a bunch of people. It's like, okay, now since we're going to go into this war, how can we reverse? Because we're gonna have to propagandize the shit out of the population. And that was why it's a very famous time for mass propaganda, the origin era of mass propaganda, just as you have this new form of mass communication, new information knowledge about human psychology coming from Sigmund Freud and others. That's where, in fact, I've got a book, Propaganda, written by Edward Bernays, who was a key figure who worked in the government committee.
Have you read all those books, Matt?
Oh, no, not even.
Have you
close.
read them all? You're looking
Not
very,
even
you're looking very, very, you know, very educated with all those books. Are they just for show, or have you actually read them?
Haven't even come close. I buy them far faster than I can read them. But I've read a number of them, though. So, and this is propaganda.
There's just not enough time, is there, mate?
Yeah, there is. Basically, I have to keep away from. If I keep away from television and like Netflix stuff, then that's when I can read. As soon as I start watching anything, my brain turns to mush. So
Well,
if I can go through long periods of time, then without doing that, then yeah, I can read. Although I'm not a fast reader, but you get a lot out of it.
I've found audiobooks my way of catching up audiobooks. Sorry, I carry on. I interrupted you.
So that's fine. So he was prosecuted and he was convicted. And it's important for people to understand that the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights explicitly says that Congress shall pass no law that prohibits or infringes upon the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and there's others relating to religion, but set that aside for a minute because it's not relevant here, and the free exercise thereof, right? Of all those things. So that law is clearly unconstitutional because it restricts everything. It restricts basically like unpatriotic, speech, which is outrageous because that would be the very kind of thing that the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights was there to. Whatever we think about the founders of the United States, yes, mass murdering genocidal slave owners, but nonetheless, despite being mass murdering genocidal slave owning hypocrites of the highest order, they still, because they themselves were behaving in a treasonous fashion against the crown, and they understood this. And if you read the Federalist Papers of their debates and discussions when they're trying to found the U.S. Constitution and see what the U.S. would be structured like, would it be a republic, what would it look like, etc. These are key things because they didn't want, you want protection against one of your other people being in power and then attacking you for your speech. Right, so it's a sort of like this oligarchical system, which ultimately benefits more of the masses.
Yeah, so they knew what they had to guard against because they were doing it themselves, and they had got a history of doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And this was the liberal era in the traditional sense of the term, right, of individual rights and individual liberty. And even though most people, most citizens in the United States couldn't vote and couldn't stand for elections. And all of these people, you know, the first 18 presidents of the United States were heavy slave owners, right? So it was for 16 presidents. So it was, you know, but nonetheless, those rights were there, those individual rights were there. And yet, if the convictions were challenged on appeal, and they lost on appeal, and they lost. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they lost, and it went up to a progressive Supreme Court, far more progressive. I mean, people like Louis Brandeis and Oliver Wendell Holmes, all these famous names that we all learn about in law school, compared to the reactionary hacks on the Supreme Court now. And yet, that's where that famous expression comes from.
Sausage is wonderful.
Yeah, that famous expression of freedom of speech does not allow one to yell fire in a crowded theater, which sounds like I used to assume that was a case of yelling fire in a crowded theater. No, it was a case of someone saying, working class people, we shouldn't be involved in this bankers' war. And that was the fire. The crowded theater was a time of national emergency. And that came out of the Supreme Court with a great progressive judge, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who gave either the unanimous verdict or the vast majority verdict, affirming the Espionage Act at the time and the Sedition Act, which made it even worse, but that's since been repealed, Sedition Act of 1918, in which they said, yeah, we have freedom of speech, but that doesn't allow you to yell fire in a crowded theater. It's like, yeah, but he's not doing that. What he's doing is saying we shouldn't be involved in war. Surely that's what the First Amendment is about. So that was a very important context for multiple reasons. Why did I give that whole story? Because a couple of thousand people, men and women, were arrested, prosecuted, and convicted, and had their convictions confirmed upon appeal, but despite the highly unconstitutional nature of it, because of the climate at the time. And this is introduced for many reasons. One, it shows that the Espionage Act is if not a partial, even a pure political offense, because that is, the defense argues, is an exemption to extradition to the United States under the treaty. Now, under the treaty, an exemption is there, but under the actual law in Britain, they left out that exemption. So that's why the prosecution are saying, no, it's not a political offense, but even if it were, it's not exempt. So that's a separate legal point that the judge is ultimately going to have to decide, right? We'll see. It'll be interesting to see how she decides.
Really interesting, yeah.
Right. But, and that will clearly have ramifications. I'm sure that will be appealed no matter what she decides, because it's a very significant point of law, right? Whatever she decides, if she says the political exemption is there, it's not. So it shows as a political offense. So you can't extradite for that reason. It also shows that in addition to all of that, and other things we heard from other witness experts, including Kiriakou, right, but as well as Daniel Ellsberg, who testified, a famous Pentagon Papers whistleblower from the Nixon era, from the 1970s, is that there is no public interest defense, like with the Official Secrets Act in this country.
I wanted to talk about this. I wanted to talk to you about this, and I've been writing furiously because I wanted to get to this. He can't, if he's extradited to the United States and they throw all these accusations at him using this 103-year-old law that is being, what I think, bastardized to use for their own benefit here.
Although, sorry, one thing.
Say, yes, I did it, and this is why. He can't even say.
If he tries to do that, the prosecution will stand up and say objection, immaterial, or whatever, and the judge, if they're following precedent from, including the Ellsberg case, but in the past, they'll say sustained. Yeah,
there's no
your motives. Your motives are irrelevant.
Defense.
And so because there's no public interest defense, it's known as what is known as a strict liability offense, like speeding, sort of thing, right? There are strict liability offenses where all you have to do is, did you receive classified information? Yes. Okay, you're guilty.
Yeah.
Because one of the offenses is receiving, so it's obtaining, receiving, retaining, possessing, all these various verbs, right? As well as publishing. Publishing is just three of the offenses, three of the charges on the 18 charge sheet, and others are about trying to get the documents, actually physically having them. And if he says yes, but the reason I did this, they'd be like, yeah, that's immaterial. It's strict liability.
I want to ask you, because you're a proper journalist, you are. Mo. You're not a
Oh,
pretend
thank you.
journalist like me, who stands on the shoulders of people like you and says, "Look, I
Don't
found
say
all this
that.
information."
Yeah, don't say that.
You're proper. You're
That's
proper
reporting.
right
That's
stuff.
reporting what you're doing. Yeah, go on.
No, no, I stand on the shoulders of giants. I basically, I jump on the shoulders of people like you and say, "Oh, look what I did."
Isaac Newton said we all stand on the shoulders of
This is
giants.
true. I mean, all our language comes from people before us. Otherwise
Yeah,
wouldn't be able to communicate. My point is,
yeah.
you're a journalist, right? A proper journalist. These 18 offences,
Mm.
if you actually look at the way they're worded, how many of them could be classed as, yeah, this is stuff that a journalist does every single day?
Um, in terms of every national security
National
journalist,
security journalist.
yeah, because not all, because lots of journalists are like you, for example, or they're reporters or they're columnists or what have you. So journalists, so national security journalists, in fact, this is something we heard from multiple witnesses, including award-winning investigative journalists who testified for the defense,
Not, not,
including
not, that, not that some progressive media knew it was.
no. Award-winning investigative journalists, and including with establishment outlets, including ones that worked with WikiLeaks in the so-called bunker, while they were quote meticulously redacting the identities of government informants from the documents, spending over a 9-month period. Redacting information that could collaterally lead to the identification
Mhm.
of CIA and other informants, which is of course a key thing in 3 of the charges, by the way. But all these journalists, they came out and they explained, they repeated to the consternation of the judge, because the judge sometimes when the witnesses are being interviewed or examined, she would say, haven't we already heard this before, right? And on the one hand, I get her point, but on the other hand, it's like, okay, well, let's hammer it home because you've heard it from one person. So unless you're
From
prepared to
one.
accept it as absolute fact, for you to accept it as being, and for more importantly as well for the audience, not the audience, but the observers, the press and others, because let's be honest, most press aren't investigative journalists, right? That takes time, that takes money. You have to be funded by an outlet that's prepared to pay you to disappear sometimes for weeks and not be
And
publishing
sometimes
every
with
day.
no,
Yeah, with no
knowing
result.
there might not be a story at the end.
Exactly. That's why it's
Be
expensive. That's
a
why
risk.
all the corporate, the increased consolidation of the press over the last 40 years, the increased cuts, because it's not, to be fair to journalists who are with establishment outlets, the vast majority are establishment outlets, which means the vast majority of jobs are. It's not like there's loads of positions out there. I mean, even in alternative press, there isn't much money. It's very difficult to even pay the rent, let alone if you've got kids and what have you. I mean, if I was offered a
If
job
I
at
had
a,
a family, Mo, I couldn't do this. If I
yeah,
had a
yeah,
family, if I had
yeah.
kids, there's no way I could have gone through this in the last 3
I
years.
went through I went through a year at the Canary, and this isn't anything about the Canary per se at all, because I love, and if I could continue, I can publish with them still, but if I could full time still, I would. But as a contributor, because I was a contributor, and I won't get into how much you get paid, but it has been improving. It's been improving as more people sign up as members. It
Mhm.
improves. That's basically it. That they get their money from people donating,
Yeah.
right? If you don't donate, if you don't sign up as a, even if it's like £5 a month or whatever, then they need to have money because there are no oligarchs financing the Canary, and there's no government funding. But I worked there for a year. At one point, I remember doing the attempted coup in Venezuela in February, a year back. I was publishing a story a day because that was such a significant thing. But the only reason I was able to do that is because I was burning through savings that I'd saved from the year before. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
From a previous place. And that previous place, the Real News, even though it was donations, and they did get heavy donations, they still got matched funds from a wealthy individual, right?
Mhm.
So, so just to put that into context for people to understand, and sometimes there are people who I greatly respect who'll be like, why are you working at this outlet? And I understand why they do that, because the outlets can put out some like serious trash. But it's because like, look, man, people need a job, and if you don't have a job somewhere, like, it is rough out there. I remember what it was like going through a long period of unemployment, and it is soul destroying, and it is spirit crushing, and it just crushes every aspect of you, or certainly in my case, to the point that, like, depression sets in, and then your skills atrophy as well. So skills that you might have had start to go down, your self-confidence goes away. There's a period where I wasn't even applying for anything. anything. I was basically
This is why we've
you
had
know,
such a decrease in the quality of journalism over the last, few decades, isn't it? I mean, decent journalists are not welcome at these outlets, are they? They think a different way to the way these mainstream outlets, these corporate outlets think, and it's a way that let's face it, is going to piss off their donors, is going to piss off the people who advertise with them. For instance, there's a
people who own
reason.
them. Yeah.
There's a reason Rachel Maddow will scream and shout Russiagate, and then they'll go to a break, and you'll have a Raytheon advert there.
Northrop Grumman, one of the main employers of in the Eastern District of Virginia, but you can be a decent journalist, but within the parameters that are permitted by your institution. So there will be people who have skill, like lots of these people who did this excellent work with WikiLeaks. They were with establishment outlets at the time,
not anymore,
and the thing is, many of the great investigative journalists that we're aware of either still publish, but they've got, so Robert Fisk with The Independent, but that's because or Patrick Coburn, for example, but they've got their corner of work where they're allowed to, for whatever reason, at The Independent, right? Which may have shrunk a bit after it became jointly owned by a Saudi, right? Because it was previously owned just by a billionaire Russian.
Okay.
Now I think there's a billionaire Saudi who now owns 50% stake in The Independent. And The Independent was the one mainstream outlet that had the most criticism published of the Saudi, well, it's really an Anglo-American, but Saudi finance war in Yemen. And so I remember speculating at the time, does that mean that we will slowly start to see less and less coverage, or at least less and less real scathing coverage of the Anglo-American executed Saudi-funded
war? That's still going on, by the way. That war in Yemen, it's still happening.
There's a Lance Corporal who's British Yemeni, who was doing a silent protest outside Number 10, who is facing court-martial because he went in uniform to do a silent protest. He did a little video to say, I can't participate anymore in this because this is like the mass murder of my family relatives by the military institution that I've joined, but I didn't join thinking that this is what I'd be participating in. And now coming to realize what's happening, I'm refusing to act. So I think it's very important people want to know more about that, to check that out. Chris Williamson has recently tweeted out a video in support of him, a video about that, a tweet about that, and he's been following that case. That takes courage, right? I know people say that going to war takes courage, but I think more often than not, by the time you're in the institution, you want to go to war. That's why you signed up, and you have all this protective gear that you think, rightly or wrongly, will protect you, and it's been drilled into you. Like, we're going to go to war and we're going to kill the enemy, whoever the enemy is, right? It doesn't mean that you're some kind of psychopath, but I mean that gets kind of drilled. I mean, there's a reason why you're joining the military if the military is there, and you think it's going to be adventure and there's comradeship and all the rest of it. But for you to go against all that after that's been drilled into you, knowing that you face ridicule, that you're going to be, especially because he's Yemeni as well, right, of Yemeni ancestry. So there'll be racism, this is treason, you're betraying your country, and let alone a prosecution, a court-martial. Military court-martial is no small thing, as Chelsea Manning discovered when she leaked those documents, the Afghan diaries, Iraq war logs, the diplomatic cables, the Guantanamo Bay detainee files to Julian Assange, which is the subject of this prosecution against Assange. So that takes, I think, real courage and real bravery, right? To be a whistleblower or to be a conscientious objector, especially after you've signed up, right?
Yeah.
Because after it's even more difficult because now you're part of that institution.
And you've been indoctrinated into it. You've been, brainwashed as the people around you, as the soldiers around you. It really annoys me the way the duplicitousness, I think is the word, as well, of what they call these acts. I mean, you and I.
Patriot Act.
Patriot Act. They do it over here as well, Mo, I noticed. They get, obviously they call it the Patriot Act. So you can't vote against the Patriot Act. It's the Patriot Act, for Christ.
Don't you love your country, son?
Exactly. Don't you love it? Are you a patriot? You're not a patriot. You weren't. They did it over
terrorism.
Here.
Yeah, terrorism.
Over here last week with the Tories did it with this bill that was basically, this bill was rammed through, and Keir Starmer and his friends also, they all said, oh no, we'll sit this one out and we'll abstain from voting on this. And this bill was to stop. It was basically a bill that would stop us prosecuting war criminals who were British from anything longer than 5 years ago. So, for instance, if there
There's a
was
presumption against, yeah, to install a and let's be honest, there already is a presumption against prosecution in practice. There's very, very few war crimes
what, do you remember
prosecution.
what it was called? Do you remember what the bill was called?
No, remind me, is
The
it?
Veterans Bill.
Oh, right.
How
And
can you vote against the Veterans Bill?
and you know the best part about that, right? The best part, there's two key things. One of it is to reduce, like make it much more difficult to prosecute British soldiers. Engage in the kind of activity that if you went to somebody, even if they said, "Do you support the Veterans Bill?"
Oh, you're frozen,
They said,
mate.
"No, of course I do. I don't think British troops should be prosecuted for doing their job." Like, okay, oh, have I?
Yeah, you're
Have I?
frozen. Just
Frozen?
oh, you're back. You're back.
Okay. And if you went to somebody and you said, because I'm sure lots of people would say, no, I don't think British soldiers should be prosecuted for doing their job. And then you went to say, okay, how about this? Drilling into the kneecaps of a 12-year-old girl after executing her family and then calling in an airstrike on the house to cover up the war crimes. So further war crimes to cover up. Do you think that should be prosecuted? And then I imagine the vast majority of British were like, well, no, of course that should be prosecuted. It's like, well, if it happened more than 5 years ago, there's a presumption against prosecution, right? So, so when you put things like that, I think the majority of people would be opposed to it. But especially, there's another part to it. It makes it more difficult as well for British soldiers to sue the Ministry of Defense, who violated their human rights, right? And because the courts have held that British soldiers are also entitled to human rights, even if they're in combat. And while many people may think, oh, that's just some namby-pamby stuff, I think it's because they just assume that their soldiers aren't having their basic minimum human rights ever violated by the state, right? They're never going to experiment with weapons in an area and affect them and say, sorry, you were immune from prosecution. I mean, the kinds of things the Americans did, like with Agent Orange, for example, that they
Yeah, we don't need
knew
to
was
do that
highly
anymore.
toxic.
No, we don't need to experiment with Western weapons. We just give Israel to do it on the Palestinians for us.
Well, the Israelis do it. People should watch the documentary The Lab, which is an Israeli documentary that looks at, it's the lab, like the laboratory,
The Lab
lab
and
laboratory. Yeah.
making of a modern British soldier was the other one.
Yeah, yeah. Making a Modern British Soldier, that's just a talk, but that's a one-way talk. It's like a 1 hour talk, which is
Yeah,
very
I'll
good.
check those out.
And The Lab is an actual documentary, and that's about the use of how Gaza effectively is used as a laboratory for
Yeah.
Israel's latest weapons. And they will literally use it, and then they will say, when they go to arms fairs, weapons fairs, like here, the Dicey Weapons Fair that is held, is one of the largest in the world, is held here. Defense Security Exhibit, something like that it stands for, a Defense and Security Exhibit. They will go and say, battle tested, and they will show as they experiment on the mostly unarmed and defenseless Palestinian population. The majority of
on nurses from Palestine and what I mean, you'll remember during the Great March of Return, was it 2 years ago now? During the Great March of Return, they started using drones with tear gas, didn't they? And now they're being used all around the world. That's where the practice.
It's the boom. It's the boomerang effect of so what was done with British Empire and colonialism, right? They started with the Irish, and then it makes its way to all the various colonies. So counterinsurgency doctrine comes from imperial practice by Britain in Kenya and Malaya, which is now Malaysia. But then that was during what was called the emergency time period in Malaya. And it was called that because if it was called a war, an armed conflict, then insurance wouldn't kick in, because one of the exemptions for insurance for businesses to be insured would be like, okay, if it's time of armed conflict, however, if it's a war, then you won't be insured for your businesses. So the government they just called it an emergency.
What time period is that?
1950s, 1960s. 50s.
So,
and this is when hearts and minds doctrine comes from, when people thought that hearts and minds was all about lovey-dovey stuff. Actually, if you look up documents that are about this time period, the hearts and minds doctrine is about carrot and stick. It's essentially about punishing severely. Surveilling, infiltrating, and surveilling civilian populations, because an insurgency is essentially part of the civilian part of civilians who are trying to overthrow an occupying force, right? So you surveil them, you infiltrate them, you also severely punish them, but then offer them an out, right? So like with a heavy abuse in some cases. So concentration camps. So you had mass removal of Chinese Malayan population, like huge, just removal of people. Their villages were burnt down by the British and all the rest of it, and forcibly relocated, right? And you also had executions as well and there are famous like massacres that occurred, but they were framed as though it was communists doing it, and we found out later, including from testimony of former SAS or former British soldiers who were involved, that actually these, well, of course, the Malaysians themselves, but I'm talking about testimony from white people, so that people will value their testimony more. But there was also, we have to help them as well. So when you offer some positivity, right, that is a sort of like an abuser, you know, like a domestic violence abuser who abuses their children or wife, where it's not constant state of terror. You abuse them, but then you offer them some, like, you know, sweets or what have you, some nice things. So good cop, bad cop. That's the hearts and minds doctrine that was practiced by the British in Kenya and in Malaya, right? In Kenya against the Maori. Do I have that correctly? And then in Malaya, but then that
Maori's New Zealand, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it's not Maori. It's the oh god. Well, I'm gonna have to look this up.
Malayan.
No. In Kenya, it's not. It's not. In Kenya, it's in Africa.
Zulus.
No, that's South Africa. But we'll go on. That's fine.
We'll get there eventually.
We'll get there. Kenya, British insurgency. My brain it's a double word. The word repeats itself. 1952 to 1956, British counterinsurgency, Mau Mau uprising.
Mau Mau, okay.
First, the settler government in Kenya. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, and but the boomerang effect is that you have things that were used. You know, the Irish are quite often referred to as like the first British colony.
Yeah.
And many of the strategies and techniques then go beyond, and then they boomerang back to the origin society. You see this in the United States as well, right? Things that are done against Native Americans are then done against other like imperial colonial societies, like the Philippines in particular. And then it goes, Philippines was a heavy example of mass surveillance, counterinsurgency by the Americans, because many people may not know the Philippines was an American colony.
Yeah.
Until which they obtained during the Spanish-American-Cuban War.
It's really interesting, isn't it? How the Philippines became an American colony. I remember
it was given because the Spaniards lost that war with the Americans, so it was given to the Americans for $1. Right? It was handed over, and of course the Filipinos, many of them thought that the Americans would grant them freedom because of all the rhetoric to come out of the United States. There's nothing new about their like freedom, democracy, all that stuff. That goes back to the 1800s. That's Theodore Roosevelt time period, right?
You had Americans going to the Philippines and fighting in World War II in the Philippines, not realizing that the Philippines was American.
Right. Yeah, at one point, yeah.
No. Japanese in no, they didn't realize
and if you look at the Philippines now, like many countries that had been so invaded, it's just a basket case of a country economically speaking. And so is Malaysia. You still have like slavery there. Lots of our clothes are made there because there's still
really brutal dictatorship, isn't it? Really, that's been
and even when they're not even when they're elected governments, it's like, so what? They're elected governments within a confine of a capitalist system that has just obliterated their country. When people when you had nationalist and leftist movements time and time again, they're like, we can't allow this to happen. This is the evil communism. What we have to do is ensure this democracy, quote unquote, which really just means capitalism. Whenever they're talking about democracy, they're just talking about capitalism. Yeah. Even if it has elections, so what? It has elections where the types of people who can be elected are within the parameters of what we get, but worse. You know what I mean? You can have like very right wing or slightly less right wing. And when it's something like even social democratic, people's brains start to explode in the press as though these people are even genuine like radicals in any way.
This is really worrying me, because obviously we've been talking about the Assange talk. I wish I had longer to talk to you about this, Mo. We'll have to come back on again and talk to me, because I mean we could really speak for hours on it. But I mean, they've gone after Assange over the last few weeks, and we've seen the treatment or the mistreatment that he's received. And then you've got this, you've got everything going on over in America at the moment, and then you've got us, ramming through these things for the espionage, for the veterans bill, making sure that we can't retroactively go against our own World War criminals, etc. And you've got Keir Starmer and the Labour Party basically lying down and letting the opposition score a goal and
I
do
think
whatever.
only 18 votes, to be fair to those who voted against
Yeah.
them, and three front benchers who were in the cabinet, so three Tory
Yeah.
MPs who ultimately were sacked for voting
Yeah.
against that bill. And
Yeah.
David Davies is against the bill, just so people understand. David Davies is against the bill. The British Legion was against the bill. I mean, the British Legion, it's not exactly a lefty institution,
No,
right?
no, not at all.
So just for people to understand that this had David Davies himself is not just a Tory, is a former SAS, I think, a member of the SAS as well. So it's
Well,
like you have,
you see where I'm going with this, don't you?
yeah.
Because I mean, they're doing this. My question is,
Mm-hmm.
why? What's going to come out? Because they're obviously doing it to protect people. So why do they need protecting, and why now? You got any
Well,
ideas?
I would say if you have like a long view of like how laws of the laws being passed. So I'm a member of an organization, Campaign Against Criminalizing Communities, and it's an umbrella organization that came into existence in 2000. And it came into existence in 2000 because the Terrorism Act 2000 was being pushed through, and it ended up becoming active in 2001, but it was passed in 2000. And
Yeah.
Corbyn, of course, back then voted against it, and it was everything that was argued that that law would do has come to pass, right? And that
Mm-hmm.
would remember, this is after the Good Friday Agreement and before 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they were still able to pass through what was one of the most draconian pieces of civil liberty curbing legislation in decades or generations, right? Because of what it can do. And since then, we've had like 16 more terrorism acts passed, practically. I mean, a little under one every year, right? So it's been 20 years, and maybe we've had 16 or so, and one that was even passed this year. There's a natural drift towards, I would say, consolidation of power, towards less transparency, towards less accountability. Generally speaking, if you look at the history of the state over the last couple hundred years, right? That's why, for example, the bills of rights get institutionalized into constitutions, although we even see now that even that's not enough,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because the United States had a Bill of Rights, it didn't stop the Espionage Act from being passed and from being applied, and not being struck down. The Patriot Act, all that mass surveillance
Yeah.
is still in effect. So I think that goes to show other things: is that if you have inequality in society, all the constitutions and bills of rights in the world that theoretically strike down offensive legislation, in practice, it doesn't matter if you've got one group of society that have so much more power, and as long as you have inequality, you will have that imbalance in power. So as long as you have a great inequality in society, wealth inequality, that means you have power inequality, and that power inequality will be reflected in the nature of the state. And so when we say why now, I would say there are all these laws that have been desired and pushed all the time, right? So we've had, it's not just this, over the last 10
Yeah.
years or so, something or so, we've had massive cuts to legal aid. We've had changes to judicial review. Judicial review is basically when you sue a public body for acting what you think is outside of its legal authority, whether that public body is the Minister of Defense or
Mm-hmm.
Minister of I don't know, the Environment, or whether it's your local council, or whether it's even a regulator. And and you have to argue before a judge, because it's a judge that gets it. That's why it's judicial review. And the benefit of judicial review is it normally doesn't take like 4 years like a normal civil litigation would take. Sometimes you could get judicial review, you could get before a judge in 4 weeks, depending on how emergency the situation is, like
Mm-hmm.
stopping a building from being demolished for like, to build some luxury
Yeah.
accommodation.
See what you mean.
So all these things have been happening, right? Making it more expensive to apply, making it more difficult to get a judge to rule against the government, even though it was already very difficult to begin
Yeah.
with, giving you less time from the act in question. So when we say why now, I'd say these things it might just be, people may not be aware how often things like this are being pushed, right? And then sometimes they will fail because of other things going on, like Brexit. They don't have the time. They don't have the ability to push through because other things they're doing are so unpopular. So these things get mothballed. So I'm sure if we looked historically, there'll be a law like this that would have been proposed like years ago, and it would have failed. You know what I mean? Like just like national ID
Yeah.
cards. I guarantee they will be pushing national ID cards again. Things that have failed before will be pushed again and again and again, as long as the same types of people hold power in society, because their interest to reduce accountability doesn't go away. Just because you lose a vote, it doesn't mean that the next government won't decide to push that through, or the one after that, or the one after that, because the same desire to push back is not about really protecting the troops from prosecution. They could give a fuck. If they really cared about them, they wouldn't send them in these illegal offensive wars of aggression where they get their arms and legs blown off and their crotches blown off and PTSD, and they would do better against rape in the military, etc. Right? It's about reducing embarrassment and difficulty for them. If they make this whole thing about the troops, then they can personalize it. These are everyday people, but really it's about reducing accountability for the higher ups. Because ultimately, whatever the lower downs do, and people should be held accountable for rape or torture. It doesn't matter to me if you're working class or not, right? Like, these are terrible crimes that you should be held accountable for. But it's the people who send them there that bear ultimate responsibility. And by increasing immunity for the lower downs, you're ultimately reducing embarrassment and difficulty for the higher ups.
Yourself as well. I remember your appearance a couple of, was it last year or a couple of years ago, with Chris Hedges on Contact, and I remember you specifically saying back then that the strict authoritarian turn that this government has been taking over the last few years worries you, and it worries me as well. Mo, please come back and talk to me, mate, when you have some chance. I know you only had an hour today.
I'm sorry.
Thanks very much for coming on and talk to me. Please tell people where they can find you. Is it the interregnum.net, your website?
So my blog is the interregnum.net, but I've been covering, so I work full-time for Sputnik, and if people want, they can find all the articles under my name in Sputnik. So if you go to my Twitter profile, you'll see all the places I publish with on my Twitter profile, which is just M for Mohamed, Elmaazi, my last name.
I'll put all the links below, mate, don't worry.
And then people can just click there. And I think I still have a pinned tweet of a summary of the final statements of the 4 weeks. And if you click into that article, you'll find my name. And then you can find, I encourage people to read it, not just because I wrote it, but because there were very few, I think, journalists who published every single day on what happened. Yeah. And even among us, many of us would have covered different things. And I think even if you just scroll through the headlines and you'll click randomly, I tried to make the headlines cover a quote from a significant point that's made during the day in the testimony. Mm-hmm. And not just significant generally, but significant because it relates to the indictment. Right? So there's a very high likelihood of suicide, very high likelihood, I think was the quote, of suicide if Julian Assange is extradited, according to a number of psychiatrists. That's relevant because he survived. Yeah, because the reason that's relevant is because that would be a reason for the judge to say no to extradition. Yeah. So that's what you can check out. Perhaps we should just mention for the viewers, the key things were abuse of process, right? Politically motivated prosecution, political offense, because those are two different things.
Definitely.
Right? Health, likelihood of suicide or death, lack of a possibility of getting a fair trial.
Yeah, no public defense, right? No public
no public defense before a national security jury, using laws which are incredibly draconian, and the likelihood of getting a life sentence, so disproportionality. So those are the things that were pushed heavily during those 4 weeks by the defense, because, and we didn't mention this, so I'll just mention this, the obligation is on the defense to show why Julian Assange falls under the exceptions and should not be extradited, because under the treaty signed with the Americans, there is a presumption in favor of extradition.
Yeah.
So the presumption is in favor of extradition, which is why the vast majority of the witnesses are defense witnesses, except for one or two, which were called by the prosecution. One was two psychiatrists, who were basically saying, no, it's not highly likely that he'll commit suicide. Although even then, one of them did say, but if he got a life sentence or an effective life sentence, yeah, that would be different, right? And that was an important win from the defense to get that from one of the, because these were all eminent people in their field, whether they testified for the defense or testified for the prosecution. But the reason it was mainly the defense's case is because they're the ones who effectively have to prove to the court's satisfaction why Assange falls under one of the rare exceptions against extradition to the United States for political charges there.
It is worth mentioning as well, although he said very little in defence of Julian Assange since she was dragged out of the embassy that day. Jeremy Corbyn did the last time he asked, the last time he asked about Julian Assange, he did ask Boris Johnson about the Extradition Act and about whether he asked him whether he thought that it was unequal, our extradition criteria with regards to America's extradition criteria, and I'm thinking specifically of the Answer Koulis affair with Harry Dunn. And Boris Johnson did say that he thought, in his opinion, it was unfair, and it was unweighted, and it was weighted in the Americans'.
I mean, it is. That's a fact. That's not opinion.
It's not opinion, but he said
it was to get those words out of it more important. But if people look at it, the same obligation is not in the States. So if we want someone from the if the British prosecutors want to extradite somebody, have somebody extradited from the US to Britain, there isn't the same presumption. So that's what's
important. Am I correct in fact we should thank Tony Blair for that?
Well, Tony Blair and all the members of Parliament, let's not forget something, right? Whenever we talk about individuals, right, let's understand their entire institutions.
Many other people that vote.
Because you need hundreds of people to vote in that direction or to abstain, right? That's just like this law. So there's the person at the top, but they're just the face of it. Those people couldn't do anything without entire institutions pushing in a particular direction and members of Parliament putting in a particular direction. I'm firmly of the belief that if Gordon Brown, who was, as I understand it, opposed to Britain's involvement in Iraq, if he had been willing to be more opposed to invading Iraq than he wanted to be prime minister, if he had resigned as chancellor, right, because you'd have to know that if you resign as chancellor, that would reduce your chances of becoming prime minister, right? I think that would have dealt a far greater blow than some of the other lower level resignations, because that might have been one of the first times in the history of the country. I mean, the people forget how divided the ruling class were over their involvement in Iraq and the level of propaganda that was waged, far more divided than in the United States, although there was still division in the United States. Here, you actually had resignations from government before Britain invaded, whereas you didn't have in the United States resignations from government. And if he had done it, but the point is, so it was known that his wing, if you like, Brown wing, and I'm not a fan of his neoliberal economics and privatization program and all the rest of it, but that was something, and I remember thinking at the time, like, it was known that he opposed it. It's like, yeah, but not enough.
Yeah,
not enough.
Maybe next time you come on, we can talk about that, and then we can have a discussion about the British American project, which he was heavily involved with, Blair and the likes of them. But it's worth mentioning there. It's not just one person that does it; there are hundreds of people that vote.
Yeah, one person alone can't do it. Yeah.
Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Mo, and I really appreciate your work. Thanks so much for all the work that you did in the last 4 weeks on behalf of Julian Assange, a free press, the Fourth Estate, and WikiLeaks. I really appreciate it. I couldn't do it. I get too emotional. You've seen me. I would have ended up screaming at people and getting locked up in myself. I know I would. So yeah, I'm too emotional for that sort of thing. I really thank you and everybody else who did it on our behalf.
Thank you for all the work you do, and thank you for having me over.
Yeah, thanks very much. See you later, mate.
See you later.